The DNA study that broke the silence appeared in the journal Nature in November of 1998. A team led by Eugene Foster, a retired pathologist working in collaboration with researchers at Oxford and several other institutions, had spent years assembling Y-chromosome samples from two groups of men whose family histories had traveled beside each other for 2 centuries without ever being formally brought into contact. The first group carried the Jefferson male line, represented by descendants of Field Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's paternal uncle, chosen because the president himself left no confirmed legitimate male heirs who survived to reproduce. The second group carried the male line of Eston Hemings, the youngest son of Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello who served the Jefferson household for decades and bore 6 children, at least 4 of whom lived to adulthood. For generations, the official record had distributed paternity among other men. Jefferson's nephews, Peter and Samuel Carr, carried the weight of that attribution through most of American historical memory, and unnamed enslaved men on the plantation accounted for whatever the Carr explanation left unresolved. The DNA sustained none of it. The Y-chromosome profile of Eston Hemings's male line descendants matched the Jefferson male line profile, and the study's authors concluded that a Jefferson male was the most probable father of Eston Hemings. Given the historical evidence assembled over the preceding century and a half, the Jefferson male in question was Thomas Jefferson himself. The finding did not create the question. The question had existed for nearly 200 years. What the finding did was remove the most durable of the official answers, and the debate that followed was no longer about whether a connection existed between the Jefferson and Hemings bloodlines. It became a debate about what the connection meant, and which of the descendants it would be permitted to reach. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The accusation itself was not new in 1998. A journalist named James T. Callender had published it in the Richmond Recorder in September of 1802, 1 year into Jefferson's first presidential term. Callender was a pamphleteer who had turned on Jefferson after failing to receive a federal appointment he believed he had earned through years of Republican advocacy, and the political motivation behind his reporting was immediately and effectively used by Jefferson's defenders to dismiss the content rather than examine it. The dismissal required readers to accept that a man with a clear political motive had nonetheless invented a specific and verifiable story about a specific enslaved woman at a specific plantation, a story that could have been checked and refuted by anyone with access to Monticello's records and residence. Jefferson himself never directly addressed the accusation in any surviving document. His admirers treated that silence as evidence of dignity. His critics treated it as a choice about what to commit to paper. His grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, told the biographer Henry Randall in the 1850s that Peter Carr, one of Jefferson's nephews, had confessed to paternity of the Hemings children and had wept in the telling. That account traveled through Jefferson scholarship for the better part of 150 years, repeated in biographies and referenced in encyclopedia entries as though the emotional detail of the weeping constituted evidence of the account's truth. It was not subjected to the kind of scrutiny that Madison Hemings's testimony, by contrast, received every time it entered the scholarly record. Sally Hemings was born in 1773 to Betty Hemings, an enslaved woman on the Wales family plantation in Charles City County, Virginia. Her father, by a tradition the Hemings family maintained across generations and that genealogical research in subsequent decades has supported, was John Wales, the white planter who owned her mother. That parentage, which existed entirely outside the law and could only travel through family memory rather than any document a court would have recognized, would make Sally the biological half-sister of Martha Wales Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's wife. When John Wales died in 1773, his estate passed to Martha and through her to Jefferson, who inherited Betty Hemings and her children alongside a set of debts that would shadow his finances until his death more than 50 years later. Martha Jefferson died in 1782, 33 years old, after a decade of marriage and 6 pregnancies, only 2 of which produced children who survived to adulthood. Jefferson did not marry again. He was 39 years old when she died, a widower with 2 surviving daughters and a household at Monticello that included several dozen enslaved people, among them the 9-year-old girl who was, by blood if not by any law then in force, his late wife's half-sister. In 1787, Jefferson arranged for his younger daughter Mary to travel to Paris, where he was nearing the end of his tenure as American minister to France. Sally Hemings, 14 years old, made the crossing as Mary's attendant. The arrangement required no particular justification in the social world Jefferson occupied. An enslaved attendant was unremarkable. What was less unremarkable was the legal environment Sally entered when the ship arrived on the French coast. French law did not recognize American chattel slavery. An enslaved person on French soil was technically free from the moment they arrived, and the Hemings siblings who had traveled to Paris were aware of this. James Hemings had been there for 2 years learning French culinary technique in Jefferson's household and had discussed the question of his own freedom directly with Jefferson, eventually negotiating specific terms for his return, involving Jefferson's agreement to train another enslaved cook in exchange for James's manumission. Sally Hemings was 14 when she arrived and 16 when the question of what came next became urgent. Jefferson was preparing to leave France and return to Virginia, and she was pregnant with his child. The account her son Madison gave to an Ohio newspaper in 1873 says she agreed to return after Jefferson promised that the children she bore him would be freed when they came of age. She had no legal instrument to enforce that promise and no court available to her. She had his word, and whatever calculations she made about what it was worth in the particular conditions she occupied. The child she carried back from Paris did not survive. Over the following 15 years, 5 more children were born at Monticello and documented in the farm book, Jefferson's detailed accounting of his enslaved household that he maintained through most of his adult life. Beverly Hemings was born in 1798. An unnamed daughter arrived in 1800 and died in infancy. Harriet Hemings was born in 1801. Madison Hemings was born in 1805. Eston Hemings, the youngest, was born in 1808, when Jefferson was 65 years old and 6 years from his final retirement from Washington. The farm book records their births with the same precision it applied to everything else at Monticello: cloth allocations, seasonal work assignments, the distribution of pork and cornmeal, the quantities of nails produced in the plantation nailery. Their father's name does not appear in any entry adjacent to their names. Jefferson's personal memoranda, kept in his own hand and separately from the farm book, show his presence at Monticello within the plausible conception window for each of Sally Hemings's surviving children. The historian Annette Gordon-Reed, in her 1997 examination of the relationship, traced this calendar systematically across Jefferson's surviving documentation before the DNA study was published, demonstrating that his movements were consistent with paternity. In every case, the record permits analysis. She was working from the same documents that had been available to Jefferson scholars for generations. The difference was the question she was willing to ask of them. Sally Hemings's position at Monticello during these years was specific enough to be documented by sources outside the family. She was a chambermaid and seamstress who worked in the mansion, which placed her in the domestic interior rather than in the fields, a distinction that mattered considerably in terms of daily life and physical proximity. Her children were trained in skilled trades. Beverly and Harriet learned to spin and weave. Madison trained as a carpenter under the plantation joiner. Eston became a musician of some local reputation, playing violin at dances and gatherings in Charlottesville, a skill he developed at Monticello, and that Jefferson, himself an accomplished violinist, is recorded as having encouraged. The training in skilled trades was not incidental. Children who could support themselves with a marketable skill had a substantially better chance of surviving freedom than children trained only in field labor, and Jefferson appears to have understood that the children he was preparing to free needed to be prepared for something beyond the plantation. That preparation was not acknowledgement. Jefferson never acknowledged them publicly, never named them in correspondence as his children, never listed them in any document as anything other than the enslaved people they were under Virginia law. But the specific investment in their futures, visible in what they were taught and in what they were eventually given, has a different texture than the general treatment of Monticello's broader enslaved population. The historians who have examined it in detail have generally interpreted it as exactly what it appears to be. The Carr nephews, whose paternity the Jefferson family had maintained since the 1850s, were tested as part of the Foster study. Peter Carr's male-line descendants provided DNA samples. Their Y-chromosome did not match the Hemings male-line profile. The biological case for Carr paternity was closed by the same study that established Jefferson paternity, and the account Thomas Jefferson Randolph had given Henry Randall was either a fabrication or a misunderstanding that the scholarly tradition had accepted without examination because it was more serviceable than the alternative. The response from Jefferson scholars after the study's publication was not uniform. Some accepted the DNA evidence as decisive for Eston Hemings and probative for the other children. Others, working under the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society, commissioned an independent review. A panel calling itself the Scholars Commission issued a report in 2001 acknowledging the DNA evidence, but arguing that it established family-level paternity rather than individual paternity, and that Randolph Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's younger brother, who had been invited to Monticello during a period coinciding with Eston's probable conception, could not be ruled out on the available evidence. The panel's conclusion was that individual paternity remained technically unresolved. Monticello's own historians reached the opposite conclusion, and in 2012 updated their official position to hold that the preponderance of evidence supports Jefferson's paternity of all 6 of Sally Hemings's children. The individual versus family level distinction does real work in the Scholars Commission argument, but it works only if the full body of historical evidence, the Callender, the farm book, the Hemings family testimony, Gordon Reed's analysis of Jefferson's memoranda, is held at arm's length, while a possibility for which there is no direct evidence whatsoever is given equivalent weight. The Hemings family had been making this claim long before any institution was prepared to evaluate it on equal terms. Madison Hemings gave his interview to the Pike County Republican in 1873, when he was 68 years old. He named Jefferson directly as his father. He described the Paris arrangement and the promise of freedom. He identified each of his siblings and the circumstances under which they had left or remained at Monticello. His account was specific enough to be checked against Jefferson's farm book and correspondence on multiple points, and on those points it was accurate. The standard scholarly response was to treat Madison's testimony as interested and politically situated, shaped by the abolitionist sympathies of the paper's editor, while treating the Jefferson family's counter-narrative as something closer to authoritative. A 68-year-old man's first-hand account of his own parentage was considered less reliable than a second-hand report given decades after the fact by a grandson who had not witnessed the events he described. This asymmetry was noted most forcefully by researchers whose own identity made their observations easier for the mainstream to discount, which was its own kind of evidence about how the question was being managed within the profession. Virginia's racial classification laws had been constructed over the preceding century in ways that made Beverly and Harriet's departure legally possible, if not legally clean. Under the 1785 statute, a person with one black great-grandparent was classified as white. A person with one black grandparent was not. Sally Hemings's surviving children had one enslaved African-descended grandparent on their mother's side, and, by the family's account, a fully European-descended father, placing them at exactly the threshold the law had drawn. Their classification in practice depended on how the statute was applied and on what the census taker or county clerk wrote when he arrived. Beverly and Harriet left Monticello in the early 1820s without formal manumission documents. Jefferson chose not to commit their freedom to paper even as he allowed them to go, which was a legal exposure for them and a deliberate omission on his part, and the combination meant that they were crossing a legal and social boundary that the law had drawn partly to contain situations of exactly this kind. They crossed it with their appearance, with their social skills, with whatever networks Jefferson's indirect assistance made available, and with a knowledge of their own origins that the law they were entering had no mechanism to compel them to disclose. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Beverly and Harriet Hemings had grown up at Monticello in a position the plantation's social structure made specific and unspoken. They were known to the white family as somehow connected, but not acknowledged as such in any document or social context visible to the outside world. The physical resemblance between the Hemings children and Jefferson was noted by multiple visitors to Monticello, and by the overseer Edmund Bacon, who recorded it without apparent discomfort, because the recording of observation was not where the discomfort lived. What was uncomfortable was the acknowledgement, and that was never committed to paper by anyone in the Jefferson family. Beverly and Harriet knew who they were when they left. They knew their mother's name, they knew broadly what they were leaving and what they were entering. Whether they told their own children is a question the surviving record cannot answer, because the record ends precisely at the point where the family crossed the line. At some point in the generational chain, the information either stopped being transmitted or was transmitted in a form that subsequent generations interpreted differently, and the generation that might have asked the right question was the one that no longer knew the right question existed. What happened to that knowledge follows the same logic as what happened to every other piece of information that a family decided, consciously or otherwise, was safer to keep than to say. Madison and Eston were freed by Jefferson's will in 1826, the year he died, on the 4th of July, 50 years to the day from the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Madison settled in Ohio, married, had children, and gave the interview to the Pike County Republican that preserved what the family had carried in its own memory. Eston moved eventually to Wisconsin, changed his surname to Jefferson, and entered census records as White. By the 1850s, his household was classified that way, and his children grew up with the name of the man who was their grandfather as their own surname, with no notation anywhere in the public record of where that name came from. It was Eston's male line descendants whose Y-chromosome returned the match in 1998, whose genome had carried the connection forward through 140 years of ordinary American life in Wisconsin. A separate family, the Woodsons, maintained for 2 centuries that their ancestor Thomas Woodson was the child Sally Hemings had carried from Paris, raised briefly at Monticello, and sent away before the connection became too conspicuous. The Woodson family oral tradition was internally consistent, geographically specific, and had been preserved by a large extended family across multiple generations and multiple states. When Thomas Woodson's male line descendants provided DNA samples for the Foster study, the result did not match the Jefferson male line profile. The Monticello research team's position on Thomas Woodson's paternity remains formally uncertain. A negative result establishes only that the Jefferson Y chromosome, as defined by the study's reference sample, is not present in the Woodson male line. It does not identify who Thomas Woodson's father was. It does not resolve the oral tradition. It leaves the Woodson claim where most oral histories land when the documentary record is incomplete, neither confirmed nor dismissed, held as a possibility the genome has not yet been asked the right question about in the right configuration. What the record shows, taken across its full range, is a family dispersed from a single household into 4 separate trajectories, and a historical apparatus that spent a century and a half arranging a different account of where those trajectories began. The farm book shows the births. The census records show the disappearances. The Pike County Republican preserves what Madison said while he was alive to say it. The Y-chromosome study shows what the genome contained when a retired pathologist decided to ask the question with instruments that had not previously existed. After November of 1998, the picture had formed. What remained was the question of what the institutions most closely identified with Jefferson's legacy would do with information they had spent generations managing in the other direction. 3 years after the nature study appeared, the Monticello Association voted on whether to extend membership to the Hemings-Jefferson descendants, who had been attending its annual reunions. The organization, composed of documented descendants of Jefferson's white family, controlled the Jefferson family graveyard on the plantation grounds and held its gatherings there each year. In 2001, the vote went against inclusion by a substantial margin. The members who voted to exclude argued that DNA evidence establishing family-level paternity was not equivalent to genealogical documentation of individual paternity, and that the standard of membership required historical documentation rather than genetic inference. The argument is defensible on its narrowest terms. Its practical effect was to maintain, inside the organization dedicated to Jefferson's memory, a racial division that precisely mirrored the one Jefferson himself had maintained at Monticello. His white family occupied the graveyard and the reunion tables. His descendants, through Sally Hemings, attended as guests and were voted out of the possibility of membership. The argument that kept them out rested centrally on the Randolph-Jefferson alternative, treating the absence of any direct evidence connecting him to Sally Hemings as something other than the absence of a connection. That argument required treating the full body of evidence pointing toward Thomas Jefferson, the Callender, the farm book, the Madison Hemings interview, Gordon Reed's documentary analysis, as insufficient without explaining what would actually be sufficient. The argument is not implausible on biological grounds, since the Y chromosome does not distinguish between brothers. On historical grounds, it requires considerably more weight than the evidence it rests on can carry. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which manages Monticello as a historic site and is organizationally distinct from the Monticello Association, took a different course over the same period. Its own historical team had access to the full body of documentary evidence, and in 2012, after additional historical and scientific review, the Foundation updated its official interpretation of the relationship. The Monticello website now describes Sally Hemings as a woman with whom Jefferson maintained a decades-long relationship and who bore him at least 6 children, and characterizes the relationship in terms that address the legal reality of her circumstances. She had no capacity under Virginia law to consent to any arrangement with a man who owned her. Every choice she made, including the choice she made in Paris in 1788, was made under conditions of total legal subordination. In 2018, the Foundation opened a room at the mansion dedicated to Sally Hemings, in a space that historical and architectural research identified as her own, positioned in proximity to Jefferson's bedroom and connected to it by the private passage Jefferson's own architectural plans document. The room's opening was not without controversy among Jefferson scholars who had spent careers working within the older institutional consensus. It was received by the Hemings-Jefferson descendants as an acknowledgement that the family had said for 200 years what the room now acknowledges without qualification. Annette Gordon Reed's body of work on the Jefferson-Hemings relationship spans 2 decades and multiple volumes, beginning with the 1997 analysis of the documentary record and continuing through the 2008 Pulitzer Prize-winning history of the Hemings family as a whole. What her work demonstrated, across that span, is that the removal of the Hemings family from American historical memory was not a passive omission or the neutral result of incomplete record-keeping. It was the product of specific interpretive decisions made by specific people, decisions to treat Madison Hemings' testimony as inadmissible while treating the Jefferson family's counter-narrative as authoritative, to characterize Callender's reporting as politically contaminated without examining its specific and verifiable content, to treat Jefferson's silence on the question as evidence of innocence rather than as a choice about what to write down. Each of these decisions was individually defensible on some reading of the evidence. Together they produced a consensus that held for 150 years, and the DNA study did not dismantle it overnight. What it did was remove the biological claim for Carr paternity and place the biological probability of Jefferson paternity beyond reasonable dispute for Eston Hemings. Everything else required the same patient assembly of documentary evidence that Gordon Reed had been conducting for years before the genome entered the argument. The broader population of Americans who carry a fraction of this bloodline without knowing it is not a historical abstraction. Beverly and Harriet Hemings entered the white population in the 1820s and had children, and those children had children, and the generational chain has continued for 200 years into families that have no local connection to Monticello and no particular reason to seek one. At 5 or 6 generations remove, the statistical African ancestry in any one descendant's genome averages somewhere between 1 and 3%, depending on which chromosomal segments were inherited through the specific recombinations of each generation. Some individuals in that position carry more, some carry less. Some may carry none at all in the autosomal DNA, because the inheritance of any specific chromosomal segment is not guaranteed even within a direct genealogical line. The Y-chromosome is a different matter. A male descendant of Beverly Hemings in the unbroken paternal line would carry the Jefferson Y-chromosome haplogroup regardless of how diluted the autosomal ancestry has become over successive generations, because the Y-chromosome passes from father to son intact, without recombination, generation after generation. That haplogroup, identified in a commercial DNA test, would appear in the technical data as a designation traceable to the Jefferson male line profile published in the Foster study. Whether any such person has taken that test, received that result, and possessed the genealogical knowledge to understand what it pointed to is unknown. The match lists in commercial DNA databases contain millions of connections that customers have not traced, and the genealogical reasoning required to follow an unexpected haplogroup back to a specific household in Albemarle County, Virginia, in the early 19th century is not reasoning most people bring to a DNA result when it arrives. The Hemings-Jefferson descendants, who have organized and publicly identified themselves since the 1998 study, represent one branch of this dispersal. They know who they are. They can trace their line from Madison and Eston Hemings back through Sally to Betty Hemings and across the legal barrier to Thomas Jefferson. They have attended the Monticello reunions. They have submitted membership applications to the Monticello Association. They have participated in documentary films, contributed to the academic conversation the DNA study reopened, and done what families do with a history they have kept and know how to name. The other branches of this dispersal, the Beverly and Harriet lines, are somewhere else in the record. They are distributed across the ordinary categories of American family history: a marriage record from the 1830s, a land deed from the 1840s, a census entry from 1850 that shows a white household with no annotation and no trace of what the household carried in its own memory or had already lost by then. The distance between these two situations, between a family that knows and a family that does not, is not a distance the genome registers. The chromosome is equally present in both. The difference is not in the blood. It is in what was said and what was left unsaid across the generations between Monticello and now. The record that survives this history is not incomplete because no one kept it. Parts of it were kept with considerable care by people who had no reason to expect anyone would ever look. The farm book documented the births in the same columns as the nail counts. The Pike County Republican published the interview and preserved it in a print run that researchers eventually found. The 1998 Nature study published the Y-chromosome comparison in one of the world's most widely read scientific journals. What is distributed across genealogical archives, courthouse records, and the databases of commercial DNA companies are the connections that have not yet been assembled. The Beverly and Harriet lines that entered the white record and did not come back out. The matches waiting in the databases for the customer who knows enough to follow them. The fraction of unexpected ancestry in a result that points, for the person who follows it back far enough, to a hilltop in Virginia and a woman named Sally who made a calculation in Paris in 1788 and spent the remaining decades of her life on the property of the man whose word she had taken. The bloodline that dispersed from Monticello in the 1820s into 4 trajectories is still present in the genome, in all of them, in the Y chromosome that does not recombine, and in the autosomal segments that persist at diminishing but measurable percentages across generation after generation of ordinary American life. The genome is not a document that can be altered, reinterpreted, or voted on by an organization that prefers a different answer. It holds what it holds, and it has held it, unexamined, in the cells of Americans who do not know what they carry, since the morning Beverly Hemings walked off the plantation and into the country his father had helped design, and whose founding documents contain a line, written in his father's hand, that the presence of that bloodline renders either a promise or a reckoning, depending on what the reader brings to it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.